Nia was pouring a $2,000 vintage red wine when she heard the mistranslated idiom that was about to cost a dangerous man $50 million and likely his life. She didn't flinch. She didn't let the bottle tremor against the glass. That was the rule at the terrace, the kind of rooftop sanctuary where the elite of the city came to play God, 50 stories above the noise. In a place like this, you learn to be a ghost with a tray. You learned to keep your face like stone, while your pulse was hammering against your ribs. 15-035 The sensory disappearance. She finished the pour at table 7, gave a practiced, hollow smile and vanished into the shadows of the service station. But her mind was still at table 9. She checked her station, adjusted her apron and moved back toward the corner suite, listening for the one thing the man in the black suit didn't know he was missing: the truth. Now, before we go any further, I want you to look at that table. If you were standing where Nia was, hearing a man be led into a trap by the very person he trusted to speak for him, would you speak up? Or would you mind your business and keep your job? Most people say they'd be the hero, but when the man at the table has a body count and tattoos climbing up his neck, the answer gets a lot harder. Stay with me, because what Nia Calloway did in the next 60 seconds didn't just break restaurant protocol, it changed the hierarchy of the city's underworld forever. Drop a comment right now: truth or job? What would you choose? Table 9 was the ghost suite, a private glass-walled alcove where the lighting was dim and the contracts were heavy. 3 men, 1 bottle of wine, and a document sitting in the center of the white linen like a loaded weapon dressed in legal jargon. Nia had been assigned to this table for one reason: because she was the best at being a beautiful, silent background. But the men at the table had made a fatal mistake. They assumed that because she was serving the wine, she couldn't understand the language of the war they were starting. Han Mu-Seok didn't look like a man who belonged in a restaurant. He looked like the man who owned the mountain the restaurant was built upon. He sat at the center of table 9, a monolith of shadowed elegance in a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the amber glow of the terrace lights. His shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, revealed the jagged edges of a tattoo that climbed his neck like dark ivy, a silent warning that the refinement of the setting was merely a thin veil over a very lethal reality. He didn't speak much. He didn't have to. Every movement, from the way he set his fountain pen down to the steady, unblinking focus of his gaze, radiated the kind of power that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. To the rest of the Alderaan, he was an enigma in silk and ink. To Nia, he was a king standing on a trapdoor he couldn't see. Opposite him sat Adrian Volkov, the man holding the keys to the kingdom. Adrian was the picture of corporate grace, clean-cut, wearing a navy suit that screamed trustworthy, and sipping his wine with the relaxed air of a man who did this every day. He was Mu-Seok's voice, the bridge between a Korean empire and an Atlanta land deal worth more than Nia would earn in 3 lifetimes. Adrian spoke with a smooth, melodic cadence, his tone deferential and his smile hitting exactly the right notes of professional warmth. To anyone else, he was the perfect employee. But Nia, standing just a few feet away with a fresh bottle of Napa Cabernet, could hear the rot beneath the melody. As Adrian translated the local developer's latest proposal, Nia felt a cold shiver trace the line of her spine. It wasn't just a mistranslation, it was a surgical strike. Adrian was taking the developer's aggressive demands for equity control and softening them into administrative oversight for Mu-Seok's ears. He was painting a picture of a partnership while the paperwork on the table described a surrender. Adrian's eyes flickered toward Nia for a fraction of a second, a predatory check to see if the help was paying attention. She kept her face a mask of professional boredom, her eyes focused on the label of the wine bottle, but her mind was racing through the legal terminology she had mastered years ago. The contrast in the room was suffocating. There was Mu-Seok, a man whose very presence demanded a higher level of truth, being fed a diet of sophisticated lies by a man who looked like his closest ally. The contract sat between them, the white pages stark against the dark wood of the table, waiting for the stroke of a pen that would finalize the heist. Nia stepped forward to refresh Mu-Seok's glass. As the dark liquid swirled into the crystal, she caught the Mafia boss's reflection in the glass of the terrace window. He looked tired, not the tiredness of a man who needed sleep, but the weariness of a man who had spent his life looking for an enemy in the dark, never realizing the blade was already at his throat, carried by the man whispering in his ear. Nia's hand remained steady, her thumb hooked precisely over the punt of the bottle, but the silence of the room felt like a countdown. She was the only one who knew that the man in the black suit was about to sign his own professional death warrant, and Adrian was smiling as he handed him the pen. Nia didn't look at the contract, but she could see the trap in her mind's eye as clearly as if it were written in fire. It was a curse, really. This inability to turn off her brain, to stop the automatic translation of every syllable that drifted through the air of the Alderaan. Most people saw a waitress in a crisp white blouse and a radiant afro, a girl who existed to facilitate their comfort and then vanish. They didn't see the woman who had once stood in the gilded halls of the State Department, a rising star in international relations, who could navigate the nuances of 7 different languages before her morning coffee had cooled. 3 years ago, Nia Calloway hadn't been hiding. She had been the lead negotiator for a multi-billion-dollar maritime treaty, a position she had earned through sheer, unyielding brilliance. But in the world of high-level diplomacy, brilliance is a threat to those who prefer the shadows. Her superior, a man she had trusted as a mentor, had been orchestrating a systematic siphoning of foreign aid. When Nia found the discrepancy in the linguistic fine print, the mistranslation that allowed millions to disappear, she didn't stay silent. She brought the proof to the board, expecting justice. Instead, she found out how quickly the world turns on a whistleblower. Within 48 hours, her credentials were revoked, her reputation was incinerated by a carefully planted scandal, and she was blacklisted from every embassy and firm from D.C. to Seoul. The fall had been silent and brutal. In the aftermath, the elite world Nia had mastered closed its doors, leaving her with a mountain of legal fees and a younger brother whose specialized medical care required a level of income that a standard 9-to-5 could never provide. So, Nia did the only thing she could. She disappeared. She took her Ivy League education and her mastery of dialects and buried them under a server's apron at the most exclusive restaurant in Atlanta. At the Alderaan, being a genius was a liability. She learned to dumb down her vocabulary, to tilt her head in a way that suggested she was focused only on the specials, and to never, ever let on that she understood the private, often sordid conversations happening in French, Mandarin, or Korean at her tables. It was a lonely, exhausting masquerade, a daily exercise in self-erasure. She had spent 1,000 nights watching powerful men make mistakes, watching them lie to their wives or cheat their partners, and she had mastered the art of the blank stare. She told herself that she didn't care anymore, that the world of deals and power had nothing left for her but scars. But as she stood by table 9, watching Han Mu-Seok reach for that fountain pen, the old fire, the one that had cost her everything, began to flicker back to life. She looked at the Mafia boss, a man who lived in a world of absolute consequences, and then at Adrian, the man who was currently using Nia's greatest gift as a weapon of betrayal. The irony was a bitter pill. She was hiding from a world of liars only to find herself serving the greatest lie of all. Her brother's tuition was due in 2 weeks, and her mother's prescriptions were sitting on the kitchen counter at home. Yet as Nia watched the pen tip descend toward the paper, the weight of her own history became heavier than the tray in her hand. She was a ghost, a girl in a uniform, a nobody. But she was also the only person in 40 floors who truly understood the language of the executioner. The air at table 9 grew thick with a silence that Nia could feel against her skin, a heavy, electric stillness that usually preceded a lightning strike. Han Mu-Seok reached for the fountain pen, a heavy, gold-nibbed instrument that looked less like a writing tool and more like a scepter. Beside him, Adrian Volkov leaned in, his posture a masterpiece of helpfulness. On the table, the contract was flipped to the final page, the signature line staring up at them like an open grave. "He's asking about the liquidated damages clause one last time," Mu-Seok said in a low, gravelly Korean, his eyes never leaving the paper. He wasn't looking for a translation. He was looking for a confirmation of his dominance. Adrian didn't skip a beat. His voice was like silk sliding over a blade. "Of course, Han SSI. As I explained, the clause ensures that in the event of a project delay, the local partners forfeit 40% of their holding to you. It's the ironclad protection we discussed in Seoul." Nia's hand, currently refilling the water carafe, didn't tremble, but her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Adrian was lying. In the English text of the contract, the clause didn't mention a forfeiture to Mu-Seok. Instead, it used a highly specific, obscured legal term, equitable subordination, which, in this context, meant that if a delay occurred, Mu-Seok's entire $50 million investment would be downgraded to a secondary debt, effectively allowing the local syndicate to strip him of his voting rights and seize the land. Adrian wasn't just softening the terms. He was handing the developer a legal kill switch. Mu-Seok nodded slowly, the gold pen hovering just millimeters above the paper. 40%, he repeated in Korean, a ghost of a satisfied smile touching his lips. A fair price for their incompetence. "Exactly," Adrian encouraged, his smile widening just a fraction too far. "It's a win-win for the empire. You sign here and Atlanta becomes yours." Nia felt the world narrow down to that tiny point of gold. $50 million. A man's entire expansion into the West. A betrayal so deep it was breathtaking. She could hear the German lawyer across the table trying to interject, but his English was broken and frantic, and Adrian was skillfully talking over him, dismissing his concerns as minor clerical clarifications that had already been settled. The Mafia boss's hand began to descend. He was a man who valued loyalty above all else, a man who had built a life on the belief that his inner circle was an extension of his own body. He trusted the voice in his ear because he had no reason to believe his own shadow would turn and stab him. Nia looked at the tattoos on Mu-Seok's neck, the intricate ink that marked him as a man of blood and iron. If she stayed silent, the pen would touch the paper, the trap would spring, and she would go home to her brother with her tips and her secrets intact. She would be safe. But as the nib of the pen made its final approach, the slow burn of the lie became an inferno. She saw Adrian's hand tighten ever so slightly around his wine glass, the telltale sign of a gambler who knew the pot was about to be pushed his way. The lie wasn't just in the air anymore. It was a physical weight, suffocating and foul. The pen tip touched the white surface of the paper. The ink was beginning to bleed into the paper, a tiny black star forming at the tip of the gold nib, when Nia realized she couldn't let the pen complete the loop. To stay silent was to be an accomplice. To speak was to invite the storm. She took a half step forward, the movement violating every unspoken rule of the Alderaan. The glass-walled terrace seemed to shrink, the city lights outside blurring into streaks of neon as she leaned into Han Mu-Seok's personal space. She could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and tobacco clinging to his suit. Her radiant afro brushed against the shoulder of his black jacket, a stark, beautiful contrast to the lethal stillness of his frame. Adrian's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening with a sudden, jagged fear, his mouth opening to bark a dismissal. But Nia was faster. She didn't look at the translator. She didn't look at the developer. She kept her eyes on the side of Mu-Seok's face, focusing on the dark ink of the ivy tattoo on his neck. "Jujosun Hamjiang Imnida," she whispered. The words were low, melodic, and delivered in the ultra-formal Hapseochi dialect, the kind of Korean used only when addressing royalty or those with the power of life and death. The pen stopped. It didn't lift from the paper, but the pressure ceased. Mu-Seok didn't move a muscle, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "That is a trap," she had said. 4 simple words that carried the weight of a revolution. Nia didn't stop there. Before Adrian could recover his senses, she continued in a rapid, hushed stream of fluent Korean, her voice a sharp contrast to the clumsy, deceptive translations that had filled the room all night. Clause 7 does not grant you equity. It subordinates your debt. If you sign, you lose the land, the money, and the rights to the Western expansion. The translator is not speaking for you. He is speaking for the men who want to bury you. Adrian lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of frantic rage. "What are you doing? Get away from the guest. Security." He reached out to grab her arm, his fingers clawing at her white sleeve, but he never made contact. Mu-Seok's free hand shot out like a viper, his fingers locking around Adrian's wrist with a sickening crunch. The Mafia boss finally turned his head, his dark, unreadable eyes moving from the trembling translator to the waitress who was still leaning over his shoulder. He looked at Nia not as a servant, but as a person for the first time. He saw the intelligence in her gaze, the defiance in the set of her jaw, and the absolute lack of fear in her eyes. The gold pen finally lifted from the contract, leaving behind an unfinished signature, a jagged line that looked like a scar. The silence that followed was deafening. The developer across the table began to sweat, his eyes darting toward the exits, while the German lawyer looked on in stunned realization. Nia pulled back, straightening her blouse and smoothing her apron, her heart finally slowing down. She had done it. She had broken the invisible mask, shattered her anonymity, and likely ended her career in a single breath. But as Mu-Seok slowly stood up, looming over the table like a dark god, Nia felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. She had found her voice again, and the world was finally listening. The sound of the gold pen hitting the marble floor was like a gunshot in the vacuum of the private suite. Adrian's face had gone from the flush of triumph to a sickly, translucent gray in a matter of seconds. He tried to pull his arm back, but Mu-Seok's grip was an iron vice, unyielding and terrifyingly still. "She's lying," Adrian shrieked, his voice cracking, the polished mask of the elite translator finally shattering to reveal the desperate coward beneath. "Sir, she's a waitress. She's mentally unstable. She's trying to extort Gerald. Gerald, get her out of here." The frosted glass doors swung open as if on cue, and Gerald, the restaurant manager, hurried in with a look of practiced sycophancy that quickly curdled into horror. Gerald was a man who lived and died by the reviews of the ultra-wealthy, a man who viewed a smudge on a wine glass as a personal failure. Seeing a server leaning over a man of Mu-Seok's stature while the translator screamed of extortion was his ultimate nightmare made flesh. "Yeah, what on earth are you doing?" Gerald's voice was a frantic hiss. He didn't look at the contract, and he didn't listen to the sudden, heavy silence of the Korean boss. He only saw the breach of protocol. He saw the invisible help making herself seen, and in his world that was the only sin that mattered. He grabbed a cloth from a nearby station, his hands shaking. "I am so deeply sorry, Mr. Han. This is unacceptable. She will be removed immediately. Nia, leave the tray. Leave the room. You are finished here. Do not even stop at the locker room, just go." Nia stood her ground for a heartbeat, her eyes meeting Mu-Seok's one last time. The Mafia boss hadn't said a word since she whispered the truth. He was watching her with an intensity that felt like it was stripping away her white blouse, her apron, and the 3 years of lies she had lived in Atlanta, looking straight at the woman who had been a ghost. Gerald stepped between them, his face purple with indignation. "Did you hear me? You're fired, effective this second. I'll have your belongings mailed to you. You've humiliated this establishment." Adrian began to babble again, trying to reclaim the narrative, his eyes darting toward the developer who was already halfway to the door. "It's a misunderstanding, Han SSI, a total." Mu-Seok finally released Adrian's wrist. He didn't look at the translator. He didn't look at the manager. He looked at the unfinished signature on the contract, then slowly turned his gaze to Nia as she began to back away. There was no anger in his expression, only a terrifying, focused curiosity. Nia didn't wait for the security guards she knew Gerald was summoning. She turned and walked through the frosted doors, her head held high, the radiant halo of her afro the last thing visible before the glass blurred her image. She walked past the rows of white-clothed tables, past the sparkling chandeliers, and the diners who had no idea the world had just shifted on its axis. By the time she reached the elevator, the adrenaline was beginning to ebb, replaced by the cold reality of her situation. She had no job, no references, and she had just made an enemy of a man who could buy and sell the city. But as the elevator doors closed, she felt the weight of the lie lift off her shoulders. For the first time in 3 years, she was no longer invisible. She was Nia Calloway again, and she was finally, dangerously free. The humidity of the Atlanta night hit Nia like a physical weight as she pushed through the heavy employee exit doors. Above, the sky had finally broken, dissolving the earlier heat into a sudden, torrential downpour that turned the city lights into blurred smears of neon. She stood under the small concrete overhang of the service entrance, her white blouse already clinging to her skin from the spray. The roar of the rain on the metal dumpsters and the distant hum of the freeway usually provided a sense of peace, a moment to transition from the invisible ghost back to the woman who had a brother to feed. But tonight, the air felt different. The silence of the alleyway behind the Alderaan didn't feel empty, it felt occupied. Nia adjusted her bag over her shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly as the adrenaline of the last hour finally began to desert her. She thought about the look in Han Mu-Seok's eyes, the way he had watched her walk away as if she were a puzzle he intended to solve. She had saved his empire, but in doing so, she had scorched her own safety. She stepped out into the rain, her sensible work shoes splashing through deep puddles as she headed toward the staff parking lot. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the brick walls of the neighboring warehouses. She was halfway to her car when the rhythm of the night shifted. The sound of a car door closing, heavy and deliberate, echoed through the alley. Then another. Two sets of headlights cut through the gloom, boxing her in. A sleek, silver sedan had pulled across the exit, and a second vehicle was idling behind her. Nia stopped, her heart surging into her throat. These weren't the black SUVs of the Korean syndicate. These were the cars of the local developers, Adrian's true employers. The driver's side door of the silver sedan opened, and a man stepped out. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a dark windbreaker and a cap pulled low, but the way he moved suggested he wasn't there to talk about restaurant protocol. In the back seat, she caught the silhouette of a second man. They weren't moving quickly. They were moving with the chilling confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Nia's mind raced through her options. The service door was locked behind her. The main street was 100 yards away, obscured by the rain and the shadows. She realized then that Adrian hadn't just been a translator. He was a linchpin for a group that didn't take kindly to $50 million secrets being whispered into the wrong ear. To them, she wasn't just a waitress who had stepped out of line. She was a witness who had to be erased before she could speak to anyone else. As the first man began to walk toward her, his hands tucked deep into his pockets, Nia backed away, her heel catching on a stray piece of rebar in the pavement. The rain was blinding now, a cold curtain that seemed to isolate her from the rest of the world. She looked up at the glowing windows of the Alderaan, 40 stories above, where life was still a matter of wine pairings and soft music. Down here, in the shadows of the rooftop she had just descended from, the price of the truth was finally being collected. She reached into her bag for her phone, her fingers slick with rain, but as the second man stepped out of the car behind her, she realized she wouldn't have time to dial. The invisible girl had become the most hunted person in the city. Nia backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The rain-slicked pavement of the parking lot offered no traction, and the two men from the silver sedan were closing the distance with a calculated, predatory rhythm. The one in the windbreaker reached out, his face a blurred mask of malice under the flickering streetlight. Just as his fingers grazed the strap of her bag, the heavy, rhythmic roar of the storm was pierced by the scream of tires on wet asphalt. A massive black SUV surged from the darkness of the alley entrance, its headlights cutting through the rain like twin blades of white fire. It didn't slow down. It drifted with violent grace, swinging its heavy chassis between Nia and her attackers, the metal body of the vehicle acting as a shield. Before the sedan's driver could react, the SUV's doors swung open. 3 men stepped out into the downpour. They didn't look like the street-level enforcers Adrian had hired. They moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of high-tier security. They wore sharp, dark overcoats that didn't seem to soak up the water, and their faces were as unreadable as the stone gargoyles on the cathedral across the street. The lead man, a tall figure with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, stepped forward. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't need to. The sheer aura of disciplined violence radiating from him caused the men from the silver sedan to freeze in their tracks. "Step back," the man with the scar said. His voice was low, carrying a resonance that cut through the thunder. It wasn't a request, it was a statement of fact. Adrian's associates hesitated for a heartbeat, their eyes darting toward the silver sedan, weighing their options. But then, the rear window of the black SUV began to glide down. Through the rain and the dark tint, the glowing tip of a cigarette was visible, followed by the sharp, tattooed silhouette of a neck. Han Mu-Seok didn't look out, and he didn't speak, but his presence was a suffocating weight that filled the entire alley. The man in the windbreaker took one look at the SUV and realized he had brought a knife to a war. He scrambled back toward his car, his partner following so quickly he nearly tripped. Within seconds, the silver sedan was peeling away, its taillights disappearing into the curtain of the Atlanta rain. Nia stood frozen, her white blouse soaked through, her radiant afro heavy with water. She was trembling not just from the cold, but from the realization that she had jumped from one fire into a much deeper, much older furnace. The man with the scar turned to her, his expression softening by a fraction of a degree. He held out a hand, gesturing toward the open door of the SUV. "The boss doesn't like to repeat himself," the man said, his tone almost respectful. "And he certainly doesn't like his assets being touched by trash." Nia looked at the hand, then at the dark interior of the vehicle where Mu-Seok sat in the shadows. She had lost her job, her anonymity, and her safety in a single night. She knew that stepping into that car would mean the end of the life she had spent 3 years building. But as she looked back at the empty, hostile alley, and then at the silent power of the man waiting for her, she realized she no longer wanted to be invisible. She took the man's hand and stepped into the black sedan, leaving the ghost of the waitress behind on the rain-washed pavement. The interior of the black SUV was a sanctuary of silent, clinical luxury, smelling of expensive leather, and the lingering chill of the air conditioning. Nia sat as far from Han Mu-Seok as the wide bench seat allowed, her wet blouse sending a shiver through her frame that she desperately tried to hide. Beside her, the Mafia boss remained a silhouette of absolute stillness, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. He didn't ask her name, and he didn't thank her for saving his fortune. He simply existed in the space with the heavy, undeniable gravity of a celestial body. They drove in silence for 30 minutes, leaving the glass towers of Buckhead behind for the winding, tree-lined privacy of North Atlanta. When the vehicle finally slowed, it was before a set of towering wrought-iron gates that vanished into a dense perimeter of stone and ivy. As the gates hummed open, a sprawling estate emerged from the gloom, a masterpiece of modern architecture and traditional Korean aesthetics. With low-slung roofs and floor-to-ceiling glass that glowed like a lantern against the dark woods. "You are shivering," Mu-Seok said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the seat rather than the air. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her in English. His accent was faint, polished by years of international dealings. "I'm fine," Nia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Mu-Seok turned his head slowly, his dark eyes tracking the water dripping from her radiant afro onto the leather. "You are not a waitress, Nia Calloway. A waitress sees a signature and thinks of a tip. You saw a signature and saw a catastrophe. He paused as the SUV came to a smooth halt under a wide stone portico. In my world, a guest who saves the house is treated with the dignity they earned. My men will show you to the east wing. There are clothes, a bath, and a doctor if you require one. Nia stepped out of the car, expecting the cold click of handcuffs or the rough shove of an interrogation. Instead, she was met by two women in minimalist charcoal uniforms who bowed deeply, not to Mu-Seok, but to her. They led her through a foyer of polished slate and white oak, past original ink wash paintings that cost more than her mother's mortgage. The room they brought her to was a suite of calming neutrals, overlooking a private Zen garden where the rain fell silently into a koi pond. On the bed lay a set of heavy silk loungewear and a thick, cream-colored robe. There were no locks on the inside of the doors, and the windows weren't barred. It was a fortress, certainly, but for the first time in years, the walls didn't feel like they were closing in on her. They felt like they were holding the rest of the world out. As Nia stood in the center of the room, the heat of the underfloor heating beginning to seep through the soles of her feet, she realized the invitation wasn't just for a night of safety. Mu-Seok hadn't brought her here to hide her, he had brought her here to study her. She looked at the silk on the bed and then at her reflection in the glass, wet, exhausted but no longer invisible. The fortress was a gilded cage, perhaps, but as she reached for the robe, she knew she wasn't a prisoner. She was a guest of honor in a house of war, and the real negotiation was only just beginning. The storm had settled into a rhythmic patter against the floor-to-ceiling glass when a quiet chime at the door announced Han Mu-Seok's presence. Nia stood by the window of the guest suite, now dressed in the heavy silk loungewear that felt like a second skin. She turned as he entered, stripped of his blazer, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and etched with more of that dark, intricate ink. He didn't come close. He stopped at a low table of polished basalt where a single, ancient-looking scroll lay open beside 2 cups of steaming barley tea. "Anyone can learn a vocabulary, Nia Calloway," he began, his voice dropping into that low, resonant frequency that demanded total attention. Adrian learned the words for contracts and bank accounts. He learned the language of greed, but he never learned the soul of the culture he claimed to represent. He gestured toward the scroll, the calligraphy sharp and fluid, written in a style that predated modern scripts by centuries. "This is a Seijo, an ancient poem written by a scholar warrior on the eve of his execution. Translate it for me, not the words, the weight." Nia stepped toward the table, the warmth of the underfloor heating grounding her as she looked down at the characters. It was a test, far more dangerous than the legal jargon at the restaurant. This required an intimacy with the language that most outsiders could never achieve. She traced the first line with her eyes, the classical Hanja characters swirling with meaning. "The white heron stands alone in the moonlit field," Nia began, her voice soft but unwavering. She didn't just speak, she let the cadence of the original rhythm dictate her breath. "It does not fear the coming snow, for its heart is already the color of the frost. It watches the mountain crumble into the sea and wonders why the waves bother to scream." She looked up, meeting Mu-Seok's unreadable gaze. The poet isn't talking about nature. He's talking about the isolation of integrity. He's saying that when you are the only one who sees the truth, you become a ghost to those who live in the lie. He accepted his death because he realized his silence would have been the greater execution. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with a new kind of tension. Mu-Seok picked up one of the tea cups, the steam curling around his tattooed fingers. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted again. He wasn't just looking at a waitress who knew a second language. He was looking at a woman who understood the very marrow of his heritage, a woman who saw the ghost he had become. "Adrian would have told me it was a poem about a bird and a mountain," Mu-Seok said quietly. He set the cup down and finally stepped into her space, his presence a sudden, overwhelming heat. "You are the first person in this country who has spoken to me in my own heart's tongue. You are a genius being wasted on wine service, and I'm a man who no longer has a voice he can trust." He leaned in, his voice a mere thread of sound. I don't just want a translator, Nia. I want a shadow that can see the knives before they reach my back. Do you have the stomach for the life that follows the truth? 3 weeks had passed since Nia walked out of the Alderaan as a fired waitress, but as she stepped into the glass-walled boardroom of the Buckhead Plaza, she felt like she had stepped into a different skin. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that matched the steel in her gaze, her radiant afro styled with a sharp, professional elegance that commanded the room. Beside her, Han Mu-Seok walked with the quiet, predatory confidence of a man who had finally found his missing piece. He didn't introduce her as his assistant or his staff. He simply pulled out the chair at his right hand, the seat previously occupied by Adrian Volkov, and waited for her to sit. Opposite them sat the syndicate, the local developers and their legal team, including the men who had cornered Nia in the rain. They looked at her with a mix of confusion and simmering hostility, clearly expecting a replacement who would be just as easy to manipulate as Adrian had been. They didn't realize that the woman sitting before them had spent the last 21 days deconstructing every shell company, every offshore account, and every hidden lien associated with their names. "We were under the impression we were finalizing the original terms," the lead developer said, sliding a new folder across the table. He didn't look at Nia. He spoke to Mu-Seok as if she were part of the furniture. "The subordination clause was a standard security measure. We've clarified the language as your previous associate requested." Nia didn't wait for Mu-Seok to respond. She didn't even open the folder. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice calm and melodic, cutting through the room's tension like a diamond through glass. "The clarified language you've provided in paragraph 12 refers to a secondary lienholder status that, under Georgia state law, would be rendered void if your primary holding company files for Chapter 11 within the first fiscal quarter." She paused, watching the lead developer's face pale. "Which is exactly what you intend to do, considering the undisclosed debt load on your Midtown project." The room went deathly silent. The lawyers shifted in their seats, their professional masks beginning to crack. Nia continued, transitioning seamlessly into fluent, rapid-fire Korean to update Mu-Seok on the specific financial trap she had just uncovered, then switching back to English with a chilling smile. "Mr. Han isn't here to sign your surrender papers," Nia said, her eyes locking onto the man who had tried to grab her in the parking lot. "He's here to offer a counter. He buys your debt at 30 cents on the dollar, seizes the land rights, and keeps you on as minority contractors with zero voting power. If you refuse, I have a file prepared for the district attorney regarding the fraudulent mistranslation of international contracts." The developer looked at Mu-Seok, hopping for a reprieve, but the Mafia Boss was simply leaning back, his dark eyes fixed on Nia with an expression that bordered on reverence. He wasn't just watching a negotiation, he was watching a masterclass. The men who had underestimated the invisible waitress now found themselves at the mercy of the most dangerous mind in the room. Nia reached out and picked up the gold fountain pen, the same one that had almost cost Mu-Seok his empire, and tapped it against the table. "You have 60 seconds to decide if you want to leave this room as business partners or as defendants." For the first time in her life, Nia Calloway wasn't just translating the power in the room, she was the source of it. The victory in the boardroom had left a lingering hum of electricity in the air, but as the elevator descended to the private garage, the silence between Nia and Mu-Seok shifted from professional to something far more intimate. Back at the estate, the rain had slowed to a silver mist, clinging to the needles of the pine trees in the courtyard. They sat on the low wooden deck of the Ngawa, the traditional porch that blurred the line between the house and the garden. For the first time, the heavy weight of the world seemed to stay on the other side of the gates. Nia sat with her legs tucked under her, the silk of her robe shimmering in the dim light. She ran a hand through her afro, the natural curls finally free from the tight styling of the day, a soft halo that caught the golden glow of the interior lanterns. Mu-Seok sat beside her, closer than he had ever been without a table or a contract between them. He had discarded his shirt entirely, draped only in a light yukata that hung open, revealing the full extent of the ink that mapped his skin. "You look at them differently now," Mu-Seok said, his voice barely a murmur against the sound of the koi breaking the surface of the pond. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his own hands. "In the restaurant, you looked at my neck like it was a warning label. Now, you look at it like it's a language you haven't finished translating." Nia didn't pull her gaze away. "I've seen a lot of tattoos, Mu-Seok, but yours, they aren't for show, they feel like a ledger." Mu-Seok traced the line of the ivy that climbed his throat, his fingers lingering on the jagged edges where the leaves met his jawline. "In the underworld, we don't have memoirs, we have this." He leaned closer, the scent of sandalwood and something sharper, iron and rain, filling the space between them. "This ivy, it's not just a plant. In my province, ivy is the only thing that grows on the ruins of the abandoned temples. It represents the strength to survive when the foundation is gone. I started this piece the day I was left for dead in a Busan shipyard." He shifted, showing her the deeper, older ink near his collarbone, a series of small, precise Hanja characters partially obscured by the floral patterns. "And these are the names of the men who didn't survive the climb with me. I keep them here on my neck, so I can never turn my head without feeling the weight of their absence. It is my armor, Nia. People see the ink and they see a monster. They don't realize the ink is the only thing keeping the pieces of the man together." Nia reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch from the dark ivy. She felt the heat radiating from his skin, a living warmth that contradicted his cold reputation. For a second, the Mafia Boss and the waitress vanished, leaving only two people who had both been forged in the fires of betrayal. "My hair was my armor too," she whispered, her voice catching. "When they tried to ruin me, they told me I needed to look more professional, to change who I was to fit their lie. I stopped cutting it the day I was fired. I wanted to see how much space I could take up without apologizing for it." Mu-Seok turned his head, his dark eyes searching hers. The ivy on his neck seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. He didn't move away. Instead, he leaned into the ghost of her touch. "You don't need to apologize for the space you take up, Nia Calloway. Not in this house. Not ever." In the quiet of the Georgia night, the ink and the afro weren't just symbols of survival. They were the shared vocabulary of two souls who had finally found someone who spoke their language. The air in the boardroom was no longer heavy with the static of deception. It was cold, clinical, and absolute. The original developer and his legal team sat like statues, their eyes fixed on the new contract that Nia had spent 48 hours drafting. This wasn't a compromise. It was an unconditional surrender. Under Nia's terms, the $50 million investment remained, but the power had shifted entirely. Han Mu-Seok now held 70% of the voting rights. The land titles were escrowed in a Korean bank, and every loophole Adrian had painstakingly carved out had been filled with concrete. Mu-Seok sat in the center of the table, his presence more terrifying in its silence than the developer's loudest threats. He didn't look at the paper. He looked at Nia. He watched the way she navigated the final objections of the opposing counsel, her voice a calm, steady rhythm that made the complex legal maneuvers sound like a simple inevitability. She was no longer just his translator. She was the architect of his victory. "The signature line is yours, Mr. Han," the lead developer said, his voice trembling as he slid the document across the table. He looked like a man who had been caught in his own trap and stripped of everything but his dignity. Mu-Seok picked up the gold fountain pen, the same one Nia had stopped him from using 3 weeks prior, and signed with a single decisive stroke. He then turned to Nia, his expression unreadable to everyone but her. "And the loose end?" he asked in Korean. Nia didn't need to check her notes. "Adrian Volkov was picked up by the authorities at Hartsfield-Jackson this morning," she replied, her voice dropping into a somber, formal tone. "He was carrying $2 million in untraceable bonds and a forged passport. The district attorney has already opened a file on the fraudulent inducement and the breach of fiduciary duty. Without the syndicate's protection, he's facing 20 years. A side door opened, and one of Mu-Seok's security team entered, leaning down to whisper something into the boss's ear. Mu-Seok nodded, then turned back to the room. Adrian thought he was playing a game of words, Mu-Seok said in English, his eyes locking onto the developers. He forgot that words are the only thing that keep the world from burning. He betrayed the language, so now he will spend his life in a place where no one listens to a word he says. As the developers filed out of the room, defeated and silent, Mu-Seok stood up and walked toward the window overlooking the Atlanta skyline. He looked out at the city he now effectively partially owned, then turned to Nia. The gold pen was still in his hand. He held it out to her, handle first. "You saved the Empire with a whisper, Nia Calloway," he said. "Now the Empire is yours to manage. No more trays, no more invisibility." Nia took the pen, her fingers brushing against his tattooed hand. The weight of the gold felt familiar now, no longer like a weapon of someone else's war, but like a tool of her own. The deal was done, the traitor was gone, and the girl who had once been a ghost was now the most powerful voice in the room. The signature wasn't just on the contract, it was on her new life. The golden hour was fading into a deep, bruised purple over the estate's horizon, casting long shadows across the stone floor of the library. Mu-Seok stood by the heavy oak desk, his silhouette framed by the thousands of books he rarely had time to read. Nia stood by the door, the gold pen he had given her tucked into the pocket of her blazer, a quiet weight that reminded her of the power she now wielded. The silence between them was no longer the silence of two strangers assessing a threat. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of two people who had seen too much of each other's souls. "You handled the board today with more grace than I've seen in a decade of dealings," Mu-Seok said, his back still turned to her. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of its command and replaced by a raw, unpolished edge. "My men are already calling you the Iron Voice. They are terrified of you, Nia." Nia walked further into the room, her steps silent on the silk rug. "And you? Are you terrified, Mu-Seok?" He finally turned, and for the first time, Nia saw a flicker of something human behind the unreadable mask of the Mafia Boss. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice. He stepped toward her, the light from the desk lamp catching the dark ivy on his neck, making the ink pulse with the movement of his throat. "Every person I have ever met looks at me through a lens of fear," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The waiters at the Alderaan, the developers in the boardroom, even the men who swear their lives to me, they all look at the tattoos, they see the history of violence and they flinch. They see a monster or a god or a target, but never a man." He stopped just inches from her, his presence an overwhelming heat in the cool library. "But you. From that first night when you leaned over my shoulder to whisper that the world was lying to me, you never flinched. You looked at the ink on my neck and you didn't see a warning. You saw a story. You are the only person in this city who looks at me and sees the truth, even when the truth is ugly." He reached out, his hand hovering near the radiant halo of her afro, his fingers trembling with a vulnerability that would have shocked the men in the boardroom. "And that is what makes me afraid, Nia. I'm not afraid of the syndicate's bullets or the traitor's lies. I am afraid of the way you look at me. Because when you look at me like that, I have nowhere left to hide. I am no longer a boss or a legend. I am just a man who is tired of being invisible in his own life." Nia didn't pull away. She leaned into the space he offered, her eyes locking onto his. "Maybe that's why we found each other," she whispered. "Two ghosts who grew tired of the haunting." In the dim light of the fortress, the truth was no longer a weapon used to save a deal. It was a bridge between two people who had spent their lives being feared or ignored, and for the first time, neither of them wanted to be anywhere else. The dangerous man and the beautiful truth-teller stood in the center of the empire they had built together, realizing that the greatest risk wasn't the signature on the paper, it was the honesty in the room. The Atlanta skyline glittered like a spilled chest of jewels below the estate's private observation deck, a sea of white and amber lights that felt, for the first time, like a kingdom rather than a hiding place. Nia leaned against the cool glass railing, the night breeze tugging at the edges of her silk robe and softening the silhouette of her radiant afro. She was no longer the girl rushing through the service corridors of the Alderaan, checking her watch and praying to remain unnoticed. She was the woman who had rewritten the fate of the man standing beside her, and the weight of that truth was more intoxicating than any vintage wine she had ever served. Han Mu-Seok stood a few paces away, his profile sharp against the moonlit horizon. He had dressed in a simple black shirt, the top buttons undone to reveal the dark ivy climbing his throat, a mark that Nia no longer saw as a warning, but as a map of the man he chose to be. He looked out at the city, his hands resting on the stone ledge, and then he turned to her. There was no boardroom table between them, no contract to sign, and no translator to filter the air. "The city looks different when you aren't looking at it from the bottom of a service elevator," Mu-Seok said, his voice a low, resonant hum. He walked over to her, stopping close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his frame. "For 3 years, you were a ghost in this town, Nia. You had the world in 7 languages, and you used them to stay silent. Why did you choose that moment at table 9 to scream?" Nia looked out at the lights of Buckhead, finding the faint glow of the Alderaan's rooftop 40 floors up. "Because I realized that if I didn't speak, the world would keep turning on a lie, and I was tired of being the only person who knew the rhythm of the betrayal." She turned to him, her gaze steady and unafraid. "I didn't do it to save your money, Mu-Seok. I did it because I couldn't watch another person be silenced by a voice they trusted." Mu-Seok reached out, his hand finally closing the distance. He didn't grab her, he simply let his fingers brush against the back of her hand, a gesture of profound, silent respect. "You aren't just my translator, Nia. You are the voice of this empire. Without you, I am a man who can hear the world but cannot understand it. You are the only person who has ever made me feel like I wasn't alone in the dark." He looked back at the city, but his hand remained over hers, grounding them both. "The syndicate is gone. Adrian is behind bars, but the world is still full of people who think they can use language as a leash. I think it's time we showed them what happens when the truth has a seat at the head of the table." Nia felt a surge of quiet, fierce pride. She was no longer invisible, she was essential. She was the bridge between the danger and the power, the brilliant mind that had stepped out of the shadows to claim its place in the light. As the wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and rain across the balcony, Nia realized her story wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. She was Nia Calloway, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. I hope you enjoyed the story of Nia Calloway and Han Mu-Seok. From a silent waitress to the voice of an empire, Nia proved that truth is the ultimate weapon. If you loved seeing her outsmart the syndicate, like and subscribe for more stories of hidden genius and high-stakes betrayal. Was Nia right to step into that black sedan? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.